revolutions of 1848 are sometimes referred to as the springtime of peoples. Oftentimes when you hear references in history when they talk about the springtime of something, it usually refers to the reawakening or the awakening of a certain group. So if you think about in recent time, Arab Spring, and references to basically uprisings and revolutions. So during 1848, this is viewed as the springtime of peoples because you have really a rise of uprisings and revolutions throughout Europe, which for the most part aren't successful, but certainly do change the tide of Europe. Sometimes this period is also referred to as, Trevelyan said, the turning point at which history failed to turn, mostly because you have the opportunity for so much to change, but ultimately in 1848 it does not. George Hegel was a German philosopher who eventually came up with what's called the Hegelian dialectic, which basically means that history essentially advances through conflict and that there's three components of it. You have your thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Kind of hard to say. He believes ultimately that one phase of history creates an opposite. So if you're going to have absolutism, eventually it'll lead to democracy. Hegel's belief will actually be picked up by Marxists, and some view it as a precursor to Marxism. I'll let you guys decide. If you want to look into it further, perhaps you'll agree. But at any point, his thesis becomes popular because it seems to, in some regard, explain the revolutions. Probably from the standpoint of the idea of having a Europe that's mostly conservative eventually tries to become more liberal. And ultimately, one political movement tends to push another political movement. Before 1848, we had a series of issues in Europe, but for the most part, it tends to be a relatively peaceful time. Certainly, we had the revolutions, the hiccups in 1820s and 1830s, but on top of that, we have some other growing challenges. Industrialization certainly has brought some challenges to different rulers as far as how powerful are they. The issue of rapid urbanization also challenges to the artisan class, and ultimately you get essentially a class struggle emerging. Population actually doubles in the 1700s thanks to the agricultural revolution. However, that population growth cannot, it is believed, keep up with food supply problems. If you remember Malthus' argument about population eventually outgrowing demand or outgrowing supply. You have ideological challenges. We talked about that last chapter with all the isms. Romanticism, of course, being one of them, but certainly being more of a attitude versus a political change. And then you have certain repressive measures, particularly in Prussia and in England. With Prussia, the Carlsbad decrees, and then in England you have the Six Acts. And then finally, in various parts of Europe, we have secret police being created. Although this will be an issue that will pop up this time, it certainly will not be the last time. And certainly as you get into the end, or the beginning rather, of the early 1900s, you'll have even more secret police organizations created to put down any type of revolutions. Additional issues that present itself more on a short-term basis, primarily in the 30s and the 40s. Agricultural crisis, you have poor cereal harvest, which does not refer to cereal. We're talking about grain prices, which will rise 60% in 1 year alone. The potato blight, certainly Ireland, has more widespread continental implications. Prices in some areas rose 135%. Can you guys imagine what would happen in this country if prices went up that much? I mean, people freak out about the price of milk and bread and chocolate. Imagine if it went up 135%. Financial crisis, you have the investment bubble starting to burst, particularly from all the guys that had made a bunch of money on the railways and iron and coal. Suddenly that bubble has dissipated, and then unemployment begins to increase, especially among the artisan class when they are beginning to get phased out. Ultimately, what this creates is a working and middle class that are now essentially joined in misery and are starting to align themselves as well with the urban and agricultural poor. So basically, you're getting almost an entire populace that is upset with the government and the economy. One of the goals coming out of the Congress of Vienna certainly was the idea of balancing this level of conservatism and harmony throughout Europe, with Prince Metternich essentially proclaiming that, quote, "We have redrawn Europe's map for eternity." Seems a little arrogant to say, because certainly that will not be the case for much longer. You will have a series of revolutions break out in 1848. While you would assume that most would once again be in France, for the most part, when they do break out in France, it'll be around Paris. Ultimately, you're going to have revolutions in major cities, primarily in the central and eastern part of Europe, particularly in the East when you get different minority groups and ethnic groups attempting to live somewhat peacefully together, but at the same time break off from different controls of the empire. Many of these revolutions, like revolutions at any time in history, is if you don't have a good organization, you don't have a good leadership, and you don't have a singular cause, they will not be successful. There was a lot of different reasons for revolutionary activities at this time. There was reactions to some of those long-term issues we just talked about, some of the short-term issues, so the causes are varied. In some countries, you might have liberals trying to fight with socialists to try to overthrow conservatives. You have different revolutionary leaders who come into play, different goals, different aims about how to achieve revolutionary success. And in some countries, incidentally, you had no revolutions. In England, for the most part, those are squashed by the government, or some would say that England is not as worse off, so they're able to survive politically some of these issues. Russia pretty much just crushes a revolt before it happens. Now, as we look at France, they once again have a new leader in place in 1848. This is Louis Philippe, who is actually king of France at this time. So, yes, don't forget we are back there. Some actually say that when you talk about revolution, basically that when France coughs, the rest of Europe catches a cold, which sometimes seems to be the case. It doesn't take much for the idea of revolution in France to spread throughout the rest of Europe. Louis Philippe was not viewed very highly by the populace. Once again, they seem to be disgruntled with leadership coming from monarchy, and they continue to struggle as far as what the role of their government should be and how it should be established. In February of 1848, you start to have some disputes amongst the working class and liberals who are unhappy with the king, specifically his minister, who's pictured there on the right, Francois Guizot. And Guizot was big into opposing electoral reform, and he, of course, liked to keep his position safe and the king's as well. In France, what they're doing at this time to protest, for the most part, is having something called banquets. And basically, these banquets are basically political gatherings. And so they begin to have a series of reform banquets that would be used to protest really anything that the king was doing. What begins really this revolution is the fact that Guizot and the king essentially ban the banquet that had been set up for Paris. What's kind of funny, too, is that this banquet was going to be actually used to not only protest the king, but to celebrate George Washington, who they viewed as a hero. The troops are sent in. They open fire on peaceful protesters. Once again, you have the barricades going up. You have massive looting in Paris. The National Guard is sent out, but so many of those guardsmen they really feel they're disenfranchised because they aren't allowed to vote, and so they don't feel much of an affiliation with the leadership. And so many of them will defect to the radical side. King Louis Philippe actually loses control officially of Paris by the end of February and abdicates on February 24th. After the king abdicates, Alphonse de Lamartine essentially leads a new provisional government that becomes known as the Second Republic in France. He is someone who was born of noble stock, but tends to follow more of the Romantics group. He's a poet and writer out of the Romanticism movement, and he believes in the rights of man, including the idea of expanding suffrage and the idea of free speech, property, and a secular education. The conservatives and liberals in the government are a little concerned about his ideas of republicanism, and they fear that it might be too reminiscent of the Reign of Terror. So his rule will be relatively short-lived. Some people believe that he was actually too moderate for his own good, and that incidentally lost him much support that he had amongst his own peers. He will eventually try to run for president after 1848, but will get very, very few votes. Radical elements in France will be led by the socialist democrat Louis Blanc, and he believed in the idea of the right to work, which basically means the creation of national workshops. Essentially, businesses owned by the government, operated by the government, but essentially designed to provide work for the unemployed. It sounds very socialist indeed. Unfortunately, there erupts a financial crisis within Paris. You have the flight of capital investment. So a lot of these industrialists that had begun to make money and really stabilize Paris and the rest of France
will flee. They're going to take their money elsewhere. They're not going to invest in this new type of industry. Stock market crashes, losing 55% of its value. And to counterbalance that, the new government will put in place a 45% increase of taxes on the peasants. Once again, it appears that nobody in France has paid attention in history class. There will be a coalition split between March and May of 1848, which basically erupts between a conflict between liberals and socialists. What are they fighting over? The timing of elections for the new assembly, the cost of these government programs. If you open up national workshops and do all those things, does it actually violate the concept of laissez-faire? You know, that hands-off approach to government. I mean, what kind of economy are you going to end up with? And then there's a question of whether you could have liberty for all men and still supposedly have a system based on private property. There also is growing social tensions between the working class and the bourgeois middle class regarding what is the nature of work, is there a right to unionize, and what are the different pay levels. By April of that year, you have a conservative majority coming into play in the National Assembly. They begin right away discussing the fate of these national workshops, should they stay. The conservative majority wanted to remove people like Blanc from the government, and they end up being pretty successful initially. By early June, these national workshops are shut down. However, what does this do? It makes the people angry in the streets. This heightens class tension. Now it appears even more that you have these government elitists who are making decisions for the little guy, and it's not going to be in the little guy's best interest. By June of 1848, you have worker groups upset with the closing of the national workshops. They claimed the government had betrayed them. They wanted a redistribution of wealth. Keep in mind that this is the time period where ideas like Marxism and socialism are becoming very popular because the Industrial Revolution has created even more wealth inequalities. When these barricades go up, this will be the inspiration for Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Maybe you want to view that movie at this time if you haven't already. And you also get a new liberal conservative coalition, which is formed to supposedly oppose this lower class radicalism. So isn't that an interesting development? They basically have taken class divisions and made them even worse. Whenever I see this picture, I feel like singing a line or two from Les Mis, but I will spare you that indignity. But feel free to add your own vocals. Well, when no one can come to the forefront and it seems like all the classes are fighting against themselves, in comes the military, and that's exactly what happens with the official creation of the Second French Republic in 1848 with General Louis Cavaignac assuming dictatorial powers. By this point, Lamartine is gone, Louis Blanc is essentially gone, they crush the revolt, you end up with 10,000 people in France dead. It is viewed as a victory for conservatives. By November of 1848, you have a new constitution, hopefully, I don't know, I've lost track, I'm not sure how many different constitutions I've had at this point. At any rate, this new one provides for an elected president and a one-house legislature. So, when you have all this wonderful revolution and things maybe seem to be on the up and up, what should you do? Return to the past. And who do they elect? Napoleon's nephew. Yes, Napoleon had a nephew, and he came to power in that December. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is viewed as the law and order candidate. He actually defeats Cavaignac. This basically marks a big shift as far as middle-class opinion to the right, so we are starting to become more conservative once again in France. This new president purged the government of all radical officials, replaced them with ultra-conservative and monarchists, disbanded the National Assembly, held new elections, represented himself supposedly as the man of the people, where have we heard that before from a Bonaparte, and his government regularly used force against dissenters. Yes, France once again has gone full circle. As if all those things wasn't entertaining enough, in 1851, there is a coup d'etat, and basically it's a coup within a coup or something. I don't know how you quite explain it. But the president declares himself a part of a hereditary Second French Empire, and supposedly a national plebiscite actually confirms this decision. So basically, you have gone from an elected leadership position to now a hereditary one. Oh, those sneaky, sneaky Bonapartes. By 1830, the Austrian Empire is a very, very discombobulated group. That's probably the nicest way I can put it. As you guys look at this map, it is comprised of a variety of different ethnicities. All these groups are attempting to peacefully